Welcome to the Azure demonstration. In this demo, we're going to be reviewing the Azure portal, discussing some basic Azure functionality, and also creating a virtual machine. In logging on to Azure, you are always brought to your dashboard homepage. Your dashboard page can be customized to show you many different aspects of your subscription with different views and different tiles to show you a lot of different information about your subscription. In this case, we're just going to leave our dashboard alone with the default view. When navigating Azure, you quickly learn that it's a very intuitive platform that uses a concept known as blades. These blades are horizontal tiles that show information that once you click on something, a screen is always brought up to the right, showing the contents of that thing that you clicked on. This will be called a blade. Inside the virtual machines blade, we see virtual machines. In this case, if we click on a virtual machine, we'll be brought up with another blade showing aspects and information about that virtual machine. We can continue down this path by clicking additional hyperlinks into different things. In this case, the resource group that this virtual machine is a member of is called RG-test. And if we click the hyperlink, it'll bring us to yet another blade of the resource group contents, all the things that live inside the resource group. And from here, we have additional hyperlinks for all of these different components that will further take us down the path of additional blades for information about all of these different components. As you can see, the more we click, the more we expand to the right. This scroll bar on the bottom shows us that we've actually expanded quite a bit to the right. And we can always navigate back by clicking any one of these red X's on top of the screens to close that blade or the subsequent blades to the right. Additionally, we can use the breadcrumbs on top to navigate as well. That's a bit about navigation. Now, one thing to note about Microsoft Azure is that just like other Microsoft products and applications and operating systems, there are always several different ways to accomplish a single task. That doesn't change in Azure. If anything, there's actually even more options. So in our example of creating a virtual machine, there are many, many ways we can go about doing that. One way would be to go to the Create a Resource button here, where we would be brought to a default search box that is asking us what type of resource we want to create. Now, these are broken down into many categories, such as compute, networking, storage, web apps, mobile apps, containers, databases, etc. Clicking any one of these topics brings us to featured apps and also a See All button where we can actually see all of the options for that specific type of resource. In this case, for a virtual machine, we would go to compute and we would click on a Windows Server 2016 data center server, or we could even say see all of the compute options. That's one way to create a virtual machine. Another way to create a virtual machine would be going into our favorites blade, where virtual machines are already loaded, showing, and this favorites blade can be customized, adding and removing items at will. In this case, we go to a virtual machines blade showing our virtual machines, and in this virtual machines blade, we can actually click on the Add button, which would indicate to Azure that we want to create a virtual machine by clicking on the Add button inside the virtual machines blade. So from here, we're brought to a subset of the initial items only relating to virtual machines. So in this case, we're going to select Windows Server. From here, you can see we have many options. We have different operating systems, different roll-ups, different service packs, and releases. But to keep things simple, we're going to stick with the Windows Server 2016 Data Center. And we're going to say Create. Now we are brought to a wizard that is going to ask us several questions about the virtual machine we want to create. Let's give it a name. Demo VM1. Disk type. This will be the operating system disk tier. Do we want to use premium SSD storage, standard SSD storage, or standard HDD storage? Premium SSD is the fastest and most expensive. Standard SSD is slower and cheaper, and standard HDD is a magnetic disk, which is even cheaper than the other two and less performant than both. Also notable is that when you're using the new Manage Disk functionality on your virtual machine, you can actually toggle between these disk tiers anytime you want. So if you start out with a premium SSD and you realize that your VM does not need that performance and you would like to save some money, you can easily go to the virtual machine disk and change the tier. In this case, we'll stick with the standard SSD. We're going to give it an admin username with the password. Now we have to decide what resource group we want to put our virtual machine in. Azure has a concept called resource groups. All resources you create in Azure, whether it's a virtual machine, a disk attached to a virtual machine, a database, a web app, or anything else, everything must live in a resource group. A resource group is a logical grouping of all Azure resources. Resource groups allow you to create logical administration boundaries. For instance, you can have a group of resources within a resource group that should be managed and administered by a certain group of users in your organization, and you can apply role-based access control on the resource group level, providing admin access to those resources within the group to the users that need that access. Other resource groups that they don't have RBAC access granted to, they are not allowed to see those items. Another use of resource groups would be for billing and chargeback purposes, where you can have visibility at the monthly bills to see what resources are attached to which deployments and who potentially you can charge back those costs to within your organization. In this case, we can choose to use an existing resource group or create a new one. We're going to go ahead and create a new one. Demo-RG. Okay. Next question is what region we want to create it in. We have many regions. We're going to choose East US 2. This last option here is regarding Windows licensing. If you have Windows Server Data Center licensing inside of your data center and you're paying for software assurance, you are afforded the privilege of moving those licenses to Azure or even running them concurrently in your data center and in Azure, and allowing you to choose this yes button here to say that you own the Windows license and allowing you to save up to 49% of the VM cost. I just have to click that I confirm that I'm eligible. In this case, I'm not going to do that. Understanding that Azure VMs, you are charged per minute of usage. So if the VM is running, you're charged per minute. If the VM is turned off, you are not charged anything. The only cost you would incur from a virtual machine that's turned off would be the disks, because you can't turn off your storage. However, you can turn off the virtual machine and stop paying for the compute resources as well as the licensing cost. Turning off non-production or non-critical VMs in off hours is a great way to save money in your Azure deployment. We're going to choose a simple 2-core 8 gig of RAM VM. This next set of options we'll go through one at a time. The top options refer to availability. There are a couple of concepts in Azure: availability zone and availability set. Availability zone is an extension of the existing functionality called availability set. Availability zones are still being deployed in Azure regions around the world, and in this particular case, it's not even available yet in this particular region, but it is coming soon to all Azure regions. Availability set has been around for a very long time in Azure. The concept of an availability set is that virtual machines that I put inside the set are guaranteed to be placed in separate fault domains, meaning separate boundaries of failure. So if a piece of hardware was to fail inside the Azure data center, such as a power supply, a switch, or a storage enclosure, that failure should not impact all of the virtual machines within the availability set, because I am indicating to Azure that these nodes need to be kept apart from each other so that any single point of failure will not take them both down. VMware has that, and they call it anti-affinity. The other concept of availability sets is something called an update domain. Microsoft routinely does updates to the Azure Fabric and the host clusters within the Azure data centers. These updates are done in stages in what they call update domains, and if there's any time that an update might affect a virtual machine, Microsoft is going to warn you when it's going to happen and give you options to postpone or do the maintenance yourself. In the case of maintenance being done automatically, Microsoft will do the updates in update domains and make sure that all the members of your availability set are not updated at the same time, so that if the update does affect or reboot the VM, that it won't happen to all of the nodes within the set. For this case, we're not going to use an availability set. Storage, we're going to use managed disks. Managed disks are a newer way to support operating system and data disks for your virtual machines. Managed disks afford you a lot more capabilities and flexibility, such as mentioned earlier, switching tiers between standard and premium SSD storage and HDD storage. You cannot do that with unmanaged disks. Additionally, managed disks allow you to do things like create snapshots and templates. We're going to use managed disks. The next concept is a virtual network. Every virtual machine in Azure must reside on a virtual network. You can create a virtual network on the fly while creating a virtual machine, as you can see that's being done here with the words new, or I can choose an existing virtual network. In this case, I have a virtual network I've already created and pre-staged called Demo VNet 1. This virtual network may have already several VMs running on it, in which case this VM will be added to that virtual network. This virtual network has two subnets, one called private, one called public. These can be configured as a DMZ and a private network or any other type of segmentation that you can do on-prem with virtual networks. In this case, we're going to put this VM on the private segment. We also have a public IP address option. For this case, this VM is not going to be accessible to us via any type of VPN or any other private network connectivity. So the only way to connect to this VM is going to be with the public IP initially. Once we have a virtual network established, we can always create a VPN connection or a private tunnel into our Azure private network space and connect over that tunnel. But for now, the only way to get in would be through a public IP. So we're going to go ahead and let this deployment create a new public IP address with the name of the VM-IP. It's going to be a dynamically assigned IP address, but we can change that to static if we needed to. Once we add a public IP address, we also have to discuss security groups. In this case, it's going to be a network security group attached to the VM that's going to currently have all ports closed from outbound access. So internet-based access, we want to allow on RDP port 3389, so we're going to allow that check mark, which is going to open up that ACL rule on this NSG, which will allow us to RDP into the box. If we did not check that, we would not be able to connect to it with RDP until we opened up that rule. Auto shutdown would be something we can use to shut the VM down at a certain time of day to save on cost. Boot diagnostics is a way we can monitor the operating system and troubleshoot common issues. Guest OS diagnostics is further level of diagnostics where we can actually inject an agent inside the VM and pull data from Windows event logs and perfmon performance metrics. We're not going to turn that on. We're going to need to create a storage account to house the logs, in this case, just the boot diagnostic log. So we're going to let it create that by default, but the name that it's offering as a suggestion. The next piece is something you can do where you can actually use Azure Active Directory as Kerberos authentication mechanism for your VMs. We're not going to get into that, so we're going to leave that as a no. And then lastly, there's a backup option if we want to back up this VM into a backup vault, doing scheduled backups, but we're going to cover that in another section. So we're going to leave that as disabled for now. Next, we click OK. And the last screen we're going to see is a summary of all the settings that we just went through to confirm that all the settings are correct. If we're happy with all these settings and we agree with the terms of use, we're going to click Create. We're now going to pause this demo until this VM has been created. Welcome back to our demonstration. Our VM has completed its deployment. If we go up to the Alert section, we will see Deployment Succeeded message. Clicking that shows us details of the deployment, all the steps that were taken, and we can see that the deployment took just over 4 minutes to create the virtual machine and all of its resources. If we go back to virtual machines, we will now see our new virtual machine, demo-VM1. We can also see the status is running. You can click on the hyperlink here, which will bring us into the virtual machine blade. From here, we can navigate to many different aspects of the virtual machine from all of these different links. Obviously, we don't have time to go through all of this during this demo, but as you can see on this overview blade, there's some basic information about the VM. The status is running, the size, the public IP address that was created for it, the virtual network and subnet that it lives on, and some other basic information. From here, we can navigate and do many things. We can also restart the VM, stop the VM instance, capture it to create an image out of it, delete it. We also see basic metrics about utilization. We are now going to connect to our virtual machine. The reason why the Connect is lit up is because there's a public IP address and because we also have, if we look at networking, we will see that the ACL has been created here, an RDP rule allowing us access from the internet. So because of that, our Connect button is lit up. We can click on it, which will generate a custom RDP file with the public IP address, allowing us to connect into our virtual machine. And we're in. This concludes the Azure Virtual Machine Creation demo.